Something extraordinary just happened off the coast of Venezuela that nobody's talking about, and it exposes the entire fragile architecture of American power in our hemisphere. A United States commercial tanker worth $248 million became the center of an international incident that reveals how dramatically the balance of power has shifted beneath our feet. For decades, we've been told that American economic dominance in Latin America was unshakable, that our influence was permanent, that countries like Venezuela had no choice but to comply. But what happened to this tanker tells us a different story entirely. It's a story about the consequences of sanctions that don't work, about economic warfare that backfires, about a hemisphere that's reconfiguring itself while Washington clings to Cold War fantasies. This isn't just about one ship or one country. It's about the unraveling of assumptions that have guided U.S. foreign policy for generations. The targeting of this tanker is a symptom of something much larger: the failure of American economic coercion and the rise of a multipolar world that refuses to play by our rules anymore. And if we don't understand what really went wrong here, we're going to keep making the same catastrophic mistakes. Let me take you back to understand how we got here, because nothing happens in a vacuum. And this tanker incident is the culmination of decades of American policy that was destined to fail from the very beginning. We need to talk about Venezuela, but not the Venezuela you've been hearing about on mainstream news channels. We need to talk about the real Venezuela, the one that exists beyond the propaganda and the simplified narratives that tell you this is just about a dictator and his regime. This is about oil, about power, about an empire that cannot accept the idea that any country in its sphere of influence might chart an independent course. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Let that sink in for a moment. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not the United States, Venezuela. Roughly 300 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves, more than anyone else on the planet. For decades, American oil companies had relatively easy access to these resources. There was a relationship, an understanding, a system in place where Venezuelan oil flowed north and American dollars flowed south, and everyone in the elite circles of both countries benefited handsomely. But here's what they never tell you in economics textbooks. Every relationship built on extraction and dependency eventually reaches a breaking point. Every colonial or neo-colonial arrangement contains within it the seeds of its own destruction because the contradictions become too great, the resentment too deep, the inequality too obvious. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he represented something that terrified Washington more than any military threat could. He represented the democratic will of a population that was tired of seeing their national wealth extracted while they lived in poverty. He represented economic nationalism, resource sovereignty, the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, Venezuelan oil should primarily benefit Venezuelan people. Now, you can criticize Chavez's economic policies, you can point to mismanagement and corruption, and those criticisms have merit. But what you cannot deny is that his rise to power was a direct response to decades of a system that concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite while the majority struggled. The American establishment couldn't accept this. They couldn't accept that a major oil producer might prioritize domestic needs over American energy security. They couldn't accept that someone might say no to the Washington Consensus, to the neoliberal model that had been imposed across Latin America. So what did we do? We did what we always do. We started with diplomatic pressure, moved to economic sanctions, supported opposition groups, recognized alternative governments, and created a parallel reality where the democratically elected government of Venezuela was illegitimate, while a person who never won a presidential election was declared the rightful president. Juan Guaido became president of Venezuela in the imaginations of Washington bureaucrats and in the editorial pages of major American newspapers, but he was never president in the actual territory of Venezuela, where actual Venezuelans lived their actual lives. This absurdist theater would be comical if it weren't so tragic, if it hadn't contributed to immense human suffering. The sanctions regime that the United States constructed around Venezuela represents one of the most comprehensive economic warfare campaigns in modern history. We're not talking about targeted sanctions against specific individuals involved in human rights abuses. We're talking about broad sweeping sanctions designed to strangle the entire Venezuelan economy, to make it impossible for them to sell their oil, to cut them off from the international financial system, to create such misery that the population would rise up and overthrow their government. This is the theory of collective punishment dressed up in the language of democracy promotion and human rights. And here's the thing about collective punishment. It doesn't work, it never has worked, and it creates exactly the opposite of what it claims to achieve. When you sanction a country's oil industry, you're not hurting the government officials who still have access to resources and privilege. You're hurting ordinary people who suddenly can't afford food, medicine, basic necessities. You're creating a humanitarian crisis and then blaming the government you're trying to overthrow for the crisis you created. It's a cynical game, and the American people have been told that this is somehow morally justified because we're opposing authoritarianism. But let me ask you something. When has creating mass suffering ever been a moral policy? When has deliberately impoverishing millions of people ever been compatible with claims of caring about human rights? The sanctions on Venezuela have been so severe that the country lost access to about 99% of its foreign exchange earnings. Think about what that means for a country that imports most of its food and medicine. Think about what it means when you can't buy spare parts for your infrastructure, when your electrical grid starts failing, when hospitals run out of basic supplies. The United Nations has repeatedly said that unilateral sanctions that cause humanitarian harm violate international law, but we don't hear about that on the evening news. We hear about the failures of socialism, about the incompetence of the Venezuelan government, about how they've mismanaged their economy. And yes, there has been mismanagement, but it's intellectually dishonest to talk about Venezuela's economic collapse without acknowledging that the world's most powerful country has spent years trying to make their economy collapse. Now, let's talk about this tanker, because this is where all of these policies and tensions culminate in a single incident that reveals everything. The vessel in question is a Suezmax tanker, one of those massive ships designed to carry about 1 million barrels of crude oil. At $248 million, we're talking about a significant asset, the kind of ship that represents serious capital investment. According to reports, this tanker was operating in waters that Venezuela claims jurisdiction over, involved in activities that the Venezuelan government considered to be in violation of their sovereignty and their laws. The exact details are contested, as they always are in these situations, but here's what we know for certain. Venezuela took action against this vessel, and the United States was unable or unwilling to prevent it. Now, step back from the immediate incident and think about what this means. For decades, the implicit understanding in the Western Hemisphere has been that American commercial interests are protected by the full weight of American power. If you're a U.S. flagged vessel or a vessel carrying American interests, there's supposed to be an assumption that you operate under a security umbrella that makes you essentially untouchable. Countries might seize vessels from smaller nations. They might have disputes with each other, but you don't interfere with American assets because the consequences would be severe. That assumption has just been challenged in a very public way, and the United States didn't respond with overwhelming force or immediate retaliation. Why? Because the geopolitical landscape has changed in ways that most Americans don't fully appreciate yet. Venezuela isn't isolated anymore, not in the way Washington hoped it would be. While the United States was trying to cut Venezuela off from the world, Venezuela was building new relationships, finding new partners, creating new economic networks. China has invested billions in Venezuela, buying oil, building infrastructure, providing a financial lifeline that makes American sanctions less effective. Russia has also deepened its relationship with Venezuela, providing military support, technical expertise, diplomatic backing at the United Nations. Iran, another country under heavy American sanctions, has developed ties with Venezuela based on their shared experience of being targeted by Washington. These aren't traditional alliances built on shared values or historical bonds. These are pragmatic partnerships built on shared interests and shared adversaries. This is what multipolarity actually looks like on the ground. It's not an abstract concept for foreign policy seminars. It's a Venezuelan tanker that can sell oil to Chinese refineries without needing American approval. It's Russian military advisors in Caracas. It's Iranian tankers delivering gasoline to Venezuela despite U.S. threats. It's a growing network of countries that have decided they're not going to let Washington dictate their foreign policy anymore. And here's what makes American policymakers so uncomfortable. This network is growing, it's becoming more sophisticated, and it's specifically designed to root around American power. The targeting of this tanker is Venezuela sending a message, and the message is simple. We're not afraid of you anymore. Your sanctions hurt us, yes, but they didn't destroy us. Your attempts to isolate us failed. Your recognition of a parallel government was a joke that the rest of the world stopped laughing at. And now, when you send a vessel into our waters, we're going to treat it the same way we'd treat any vessel that we believe is violating our sovereignty. This is a remarkable shift in the power dynamics of the hemisphere, and it didn't happen overnight. It happened because American policy was so rigid, so ideological, so detached from reality that it created the very outcome it was trying to prevent. Let's talk about sanctions more broadly, because Venezuela is just one example of a failed strategy that the United States keeps repeating. We have sanctions on Cuba that have been in place for over 60 years. Did they lead to regime change? Did they hurt ordinary Cubans? Absolutely. We have sanctions on Iran that have been tightened and loosened and tightened again for decades. Did they lead to regime change? Did they empower hardliners and hurt moderates? Yes. We have sanctions on North Korea, on Syria, on various other countries, and the pattern is always the same. The sanctions don't achieve their stated objectives. They create humanitarian suffering, and they push the targeted countries into the arms of America's rivals. This is what I mean when I talk about the failure of American economic coercion. It's not that economic pressure can never work. It's that the way the United States uses economic pressure is counterproductive. We're trying to use our economic power as a weapon to force political outcomes, but we're doing it in a world where there are alternatives now. When we cut a country off from the dollar-based financial system, they don't just collapse anymore. They find other currencies to trade in. When we tell countries they can't buy American technology, they develop their own or buy from China. When we block access to international institutions we control, they build parallel institutions. We're accelerating the very processes that undermine our own power, and we're too ideologically committed to the strategy to change course. The Venezuelan situation also reveals something crucial about the nature of American power in Latin America. For over a century, the United States has viewed this hemisphere as its backyard, a region where we have special prerogatives, where our security interests take precedence, where governments exist at our pleasure. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, established the principle that European powers should stay out of the Americas. But what it really meant was that this was America's sphere of influence. Every U.S. intervention in Latin America since then, and there have been dozens, has been justified by this sense of proprietary ownership over the hemisphere. But that era is ending. not because the United States has decided to embrace a more egalitarian relationship with Latin American countries, but because we no longer have the power to maintain the old system. Our economic dominance has been eroded by decades of deindustrialization and the rise of China as a trading partner. Our military is overstretched across multiple regions of the world. Our political system is so dysfunctional that we can't even agree on basic domestic policies, let alone sustain a coherent foreign policy. And most importantly, Latin American countries have simply stopped accepting the premise that they should subordinate their interests to ours. Look at what's happened across the region in recent years. Left-leaning governments have been elected in Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and other countries, despite American preferences for more conservative, market-friendly leaders. These governments aren't revolutionary in the traditional sense. They're not trying to overthrow capitalism or build socialist utopias, but they are asserting greater sovereignty, questioning the neoliberal economic model, building relationships with China and other powers, and generally refusing to take orders from Washington. This is a quiet revolution in hemispheric relations, and the incident with this tanker is just one symptom of a much broader transformation. Now, here's where this gets really interesting from an economic perspective. The United States built the post-World War II international order based on certain assumptions. We assumed that everyone would want to be part of a system where we made the rules. We assumed that access to American markets and American financial institutions was so valuable that countries would sacrifice their sovereignty to maintain it. We assumed that economic interdependence would give us leverage over other countries. But what happens when those assumptions break down? What happens when countries decide that sovereignty is more valuable than market access? What happens when they build alternative systems that don't require American participation? This is the nightmare scenario for American policymakers, and it's happening right now. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanded to include others, are explicitly working to create alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. They're setting up development banks that compete with the IMF and World Bank. They're creating payment systems that bypass SWIFT, the American-controlled financial messaging system. They're denominating trade in their own currencies instead of dollars. These efforts are still in early stages. They face significant challenges, but the direction is clear. The world is becoming less American-centric, not because of American decline in some absolute sense, but because other centers of power are rising and refusing to play by rules they had no role in making. Venezuela, in this context, is a test case. If a relatively small country with a devastated economy can defy American sanctions, can maintain its government despite our best efforts to overthrow it, can take action against American commercial interests without facing overwhelming retaliation, then what does that say about American power? What does that say about the effectiveness of our foreign policy tools? What does that say about our ability to shape outcomes in regions we've long considered our exclusive domain? These are uncomfortable questions, and rather than grappling with them honestly, our foreign policy establishment just keeps doing the same things and expecting different results. The targeting of this tanker should force a fundamental rethinking of American policy toward Venezuela and toward economic coercion more broadly. It's not going to because our political system is too calcified and our foreign policy elite is too invested in maintaining the illusion of American omnipotence. But it should. We should be asking whether sanctions that clearly aren't working should be continued. We should be asking whether the humanitarian cost of our policies is justified by the strategic benefits, assuming there are any strategic benefits. We should be asking whether treating Latin American countries as subordinate rather than as partners serves our long-term interests. We should be asking whether a more multipolar world might actually be more stable than one where we try to maintain unilateral dominance. But these questions threaten too many assumptions, too many careers, too many institutional interests to be seriously considered in Washington. Here's what I think is going to happen, and I say this not with satisfaction, but with deep concern. The United States is going to continue down this path of using sanctions and economic coercion as primary foreign policy tools, even as they become less effective. We're going to continue to see incidents like this tanker situation where American interests are challenged, and we discover that our actual ability to respond is limited. We're going to continue to push countries into arrangements with our rivals and then express shock that they're not aligned with us. We're going to continue to treat symptoms rather than addressing root causes, to apply the same failed strategies to new situations, to confuse the assertion of power with the effective use of power. And in the meantime, ordinary people in Venezuela and in other sanctioned countries will continue to suffer. That's the real tragedy here. The policy elite in Washington and Caracas will be fine. The oil executives and the military contractors and the politicians will be fine. It's the nurses and teachers and shopkeepers and farmers who pay the price for these geopolitical games. It's always been this way, but we're not supposed to say it quite so boldly. We're supposed to pretend that there are noble principles at stake, that we're defending democracy or human rights or some other high-minded ideal, and maybe some of the people implementing these policies genuinely believe that, but the results speak for themselves. The sanctions didn't bring democracy to Venezuela. They brought hunger and suffering. The isolation didn't weaken the government. It gave the government a convenient external enemy to blame for internal problems. The economic warfare didn't create the conditions for positive change. It created desperation and resentment. This tanker incident is a mirror being held up to American foreign policy, and we don't like what we see reflected back. We see a strategy that isn't working, a dominance that's fading, an international order that's fragmenting, despite our efforts to hold it together. We see other countries not just challenging American power, but building systems specifically designed to function without American approval. We see the limits of what economic coercion can achieve in a multipolar world. And most disturbing of all, we see that many countries now believe that standing up to the United States is not only possible, but potentially advantageous. The question isn't whether this represents a decline in American power. It clearly does, at least in relative terms. The question is whether we're going to adapt to this new reality or keep pretending that it's still 1995 and we're the sole superpower that can remake the world according to our preferences. So far, all evidence suggests we're choosing delusion over adaptation, ideology over pragmatism, the comfort of familiar failures over the uncertainty of trying something different. And that's why we're going to see more incidents like this tanker, more challenges to American interests, more signs that the world order we built is giving way to something new. The tragedy is that we could be shaping that transition, but instead we're flailing against it, making it more chaotic and more dangerous than it needs to be. That's what went wrong with this tanker. That's what's going wrong with American foreign policy. And until we're willing to have an honest conversation about it, nothing is going to change.